Many different people collect many different things for many different reasons. Whether it's pure nostalgia, you do it just for fun, connecting with your kids on some level, on some common ground, whether it's something that's you find to be therapeutic. One thing is consistent amongst most people who collect, and that is the evolution of taste, expectations, and sensibilities in collecting. I'm going to talk about this today, whether you're a G1 collector, a mainline chug collector, a masterpiece collector, legends collector, you collect even higher end stuff than that. We're going to talk about it today. When it comes to collecting, usually there's something that brings people into it. It's a G1 figure or set of figures. It's the chug mainline that you see at the store for the most part. Now there's people that come on board and just collect G1, just collect chug, just collect masterpiece. They see a masterpiece, they realize this is something they want to get into, they only collect that. You see that with Star Wars and Hot Toys. You see it in many different areas, not just the Transformers world. But today I want to start talking about G1 and work my way up through the evolution and just talk about this. Now, if you just collect one thing, say G1 or Chug or Masterpiece or any of that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that because, first of all, one thing that I like about collecting G1 and G1 only is it's finite, meaning that there's nothing new to add to the G1. Now, yeah, you may get a figure that was never released, such as like the Generations RC, that was never released in G1 and you want to add that to your collection, but that's a kind of a one-off kind of deal. And maybe, Alpha Trion or some other stuff like that. But the reality of it is, collecting any vintage line is finite, which makes it, in my opinion, a lot of fun to collect because you can complete it and there is an end in mind for it. I found it fun going back and trying to recollect all the G1, but there's a lot of figures to it. And then you get into your own evolution with collecting G1. Even collecting vintage stuff, you evolve. Your expectation changes. In the beginning of collecting in the vintage, for me, I took any beat up piece of junk as long as it was cheap and it was a good representation of the figure. Now I don't really want to mess with it unless it's complete and in pristine condition. So I have evolved in that manner, and I see a lot of people evolve that way. I went from quantity to quality. But another way that people evolve, that collect G1 and G1 only, you see this. They get into more obscure characters they never had as a kid. They're collecting stuff they never had before, and that actually becomes more of the prize figures, more of the grail figures. And so going after these figures, hey, they've never had them before. It's interesting and exciting to get your hands on them for the first time and to check them out, and it's really cool. But sometimes that's not even enough. When it comes to collecting, they get into the Japanese continuity. Now this is when you start getting into some serious money, and it's getting harder and harder to get your hands on these if they were never released in the US. There is an evolution of G1 collectors, and I see it all the time, and guess what? It's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of money trying to go down that route. So let's get into the Chug collector. I find a lot of Chug collectors start out as Chug collectors and move to Masterpiece collectors. In fact, there are more Chug collectors than Masterpiece collectors, and those numbers have been thrown around a lot, but I don't have exact numbers. I just know it from a lot of different discussions and people talking about it, and of course, Hasbro production numbers versus, say, third-party Masterpiece production numbers. But people that get into collecting Chug, there's a lot of good reasons to collect Chug, and a lot of reasons to get into it. First of all, price. You do get a lot of bang for your buck when you buy a Chug figure. So like a $20 or $30 Chug figure, I do see that is probably the best value in all of the Transformers lines, is getting a Chug figure, a mainline, and that's simply because they are so mass produced, and that's how they get the price down and keep the cost down. Now, the complexity, they are more complex now than they used to be, but they're not as complex as, say, a Masterpiece figure. Also, the transformation with that complexity is a little bit simpler and a lot easier, and of course less breakage, so they're more durable. Also, the availability of figures, it's easier to get than, say, Masterpiece and other higher end, even easier to get than a lot of the G1s of the counterparts that they're making. And of course, you're getting into some obscurity. And I love the fact that we have more obscure figures that's made by Hasbro, that we get the opportunity to buy these, get our hands on these. So if you're collecting mainline, it's easier to get your hands on mainline stuff than, say, third party. If you miss a release from mainline, you can usually still track it down for not a huge late tax, but of course with Masterpiece, you get hit with that. Now, Chug collectors have seen an evolution, not just in their own tastes and their expectations and sensibilities, but you've also seen the evolution of Hasbro. As time's gone by, Hasbro has gotten closer to G1 with every iteration. We're going to use this Soundwave for example, and I know in the earlier days they weren't really targeting G1 100%, but they're getting closer there. But also the engineering's getting better, it's getting more spot on, but yes, there are still some imperfections with, say, the Siege and the Earthrise, with some gaps and a couple of some waffling that's still going on. But in the end, you have to admit, looking at them, that aesthetically they look good, they're getting better, they're going in the right direction, and almost like mini masterpieces. And of course, they're giving us obscure characters and making massive improvements on those from the G1 to make them look so much more like the show and cartoon accurate. And collectors are talking with their wallets that love these figures. I think that they did a really good job at the Titan Returns line. Even though some of those really weren't headmasters, it still was great to get them. Now, some collectors move on to collecting Masterpiece. From Chug to Masterpiece, they collect just Chug forever. But I'm going to talk about Legends before I talk about Masterpiece. So what we're seeing in Legends is that they're getting better and better every year. In almost every release, it just seems like each release, New Age, Magic Square, Iron Factory, they're all doing a really great job with these figures. And they're looking so good, and every release gets better. We sure have come a long way from the beginnings of the Legends collecting. Since DX9 was one of the first companies to start putting out these Legends scale figures, and I have to say that they did a pretty good job for the time. But now the game is getting up, and the collectors are changing. They're evolving with their tastes, their expectations are evolving, and if you're not wowing with each release, you're not selling those releases. But there's something else about Legends I want to talk about. It seems that Legends figures are made in much smaller quantities than you would realize. Now, the price is a little bit higher because of the parts count. The engineering is still there, and then they have to create the molds that make this. But what they do to get their money or to get the return on that investment to make the mold and the engineering, all that, is look at Magic Square with their Optimus Prime, and they put out 5, 6, 7 different colors of this Optimus Prime. That's how they do it. But each run is so much smaller, and I would venture to say half, if not a third of the size of the average Fans Toys run. But Legends is really where it's at, with the most figures coming out the fastest, and of course they're quicker, cheaper, easier to make, and they usually sell out pretty well simply because of the price point, the aesthetic. They're super G1, they're simple to transform, so there's a whole lot of good about it. The only thing is, some people have a problem paying $30 to $50 for a 3-inch figure. So now we're getting into talking about some Masterpiece stuff. Now, with Masterpiece figures, you're definitely gonna see a change, a variation. I would have to say the Masterpiece collectors, third-party collectors of the Masterpiece figures, have had the most evolution of their expectations and their taste, their sensibilities over the past decade. And here is why. With every Masterpiece release, Takara slightly shifts those tastes and those aesthetics. Now, this is kind of a combination of collectors asking for it and Takara just giving it or moving it in that direction. So when we started out with an MP01, which was big and he looked cool, and at the time blew everyone's mind. MP10 comes out, which of course looks good, and everybody acted like it was the most definitive figure. I still felt like it had a couple of opportunities, like the lower legs, but I thought it was pretty cool. I was excited for it. They also adjusted down the scale, so they're changing things. They're bringing the 9-inch scale in. And then MP44 comes, and in comes the Toon. Now, of course, they went Toon way before MP44, but MP44 is the flagship figure and a Toon figure, and spurs the real world aesthetic versus the Toon debate, of course. Now, this whole recency bias of a thought process and discussion going on with Fans Toys Willis versus Hound. Now, the whole argument here, looking at Fans Toys Willis, that is more of a real world look. Hound is more of cartoon. Almost everyone agrees the new Takara Hound looks great. There are some issues with it being lighter than Fans Toys, maybe some breakage issues with it, but the reality of it is most people think that the new one looks good. But a lot of people like the real world aesthetic, the weight, and things going with the Fans Toys, and therein lies some of these changes in this evolution. Are we going to evolve everyone to Toon? Probably not. The reality of it is a lot of people were evolved to a real world. From a cartoon mentality, an idea in the beginning to say, you know what, I think I like the real world look the best. And there is a distinct group of people that say, I want the real world or I want Toon. And this continues to go on today. I think that getting that mixture somewhere in between, not super hyper Toon, not 100% like a real world representation, somewhere in between I think satisfies both collectors. I think Fans Toys walks that line pretty good most of the time. It looks like it's Toon with a bit of a real world representation and not 100% real world. Fans Toys does usually do that very well. But I'm also going to take this opportunity to show you one thing that's kind of interesting is the changing tastes and expectations for collectors from Kronos to Phoenix. Now, obviously, everyone knows Kronos was a rough figure, a bad figure, but people wanted it because it was all we had. Now that we have options and we see what can be done, people's minds are open to bigger, better things, such as Fans Toys Phoenix. And looking at this, our expectations are really high going forward from now on. I know everybody has high expectations for a lot of the figures that are coming out this year, including myself. And I have to say that maybe my expectations are far higher now than they were just 3 years ago. And why is that? Well, it's because we've had a lot of great releases. We've seen what these companies can do. We've seen what's available out there. And we're expecting quite a bit for the money that we spend on these figures. So the next evolutionary step from Masterpiece is into something that is bigger and more massive and, well, 10 times more expensive. This Ultimetal series of gigantic, 18-inch figures. They're huge. They have lights and articulation, all kinds of crazy stuff with them. And with that, that is a step in a whole different direction. Now, I personally am not in for it, but I think it's awesome. I think it's great that these figures even exist, and I know that anybody that's handled them is highly impressed. But we're actually going to get even more of that kind of stuff coming up in the Bumblebee movie line of figures, which it's even more impressive and more amazing what's coming out. But this high-end, super expensive set of figures is going in a whole new direction. And of course, we can't really talk about high-end collectibles in the Transformer world without talking about statues. Now, something about statues, they are very expensive, but they are posed in one pose. They're going to stay static, but they deliver some real, real world, real Toon aesthetics as close to perfection as you could possibly get. And of course, there's not going to be any more posability. You can't transform them. Some have lights. Some have some swappable, maybe you can swap out a part or two on them to change them up a little bit. But in the end, these things are as close as you're going to get to matching either Toon or real world type aesthetic or going that direction. And it is just one of those things that it's super next level. I'm not into it yet. I'm not about the statue life yet, but I know a lot of people are, and everybody that I know that has gotten into the statues absolutely loves them. So that, hey, that's an evolution that I'm not there yet. I'm not that evolved. So what do you guys think about the evolution of collecting, and where are you? What do you collect, and where did you start? What got you into it? Put all that in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and Tydirium Hanger out.